Through the years, hundreds of people have been lost in the Great Smoky Mountains. Some for just a few hours, some for days, but in modern history, only 4 still remain missing decades later. One of them, a 16-year-old girl who disappeared on a school hike.
Deep within the Appalachian Mountains, a series of mysterious disappearances have fueled unsettling rumors of wild, feral people living hidden in the woods. These individuals, believed to be descendants of a lost community, chose to remain in isolation and have a disturbing practice of consuming humans. Are these stories just myths, or is there a chilling truth hiding in the shadows of Appalachia? Join us as we explore the unsettling connection between the feral people and those who visited the mountains never to return. The ferals. During the Civil War, countless soldiers from both the North and South abandoned their posts. They fled to the hills, hoping to escape the brutal reality of war. But those who ran were hunted down and arrested. Some were shot by firing squads, while others met their end at the end of a rope. Even families who hid their loved ones, sons, brothers, fathers, and nephews, were punished just as harshly. In some cases, these men retreated deeper into the mountains to protect their families, hoping to vanish into the wilderness. Decades later, in the 1930s, a new battle broke out in the coal mines of West Virginia, Tennessee, and Harlan, Kentucky. When mine owners slashed workers' wages, miners fought back with strikes and violent protests. The conflict, known as the Harlan County War, turned bloody, and some miners escaped deeper into the mountains to avoid capture. Many were never found. Since then, hikers and visitors have shared terrifying stories of wild people lurking deep in the Appalachian Mountains. These tales were often brushed off as myths until the horrifying incident in 1969. Dennis Lloyd Martin Mystery. On June 14, 1969, 7-year-old Dennis Lloyd Martin went camping with his family and friends in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The group included his brother Douglas, their father Bill, and grandfather Clyde, along with some family friends and their 2 younger boys. The children were playing hide-and-seek near Spence Field when Dennis wandered off towards the Appalachian Trail. After a few minutes, the other boys jumped out, but Dennis had vanished. Bill, his father, started calling out for him and followed a trail west for about a mile before turning back. Meanwhile, Clyde, the grandfather, made his way down Anthony Creek to Cades Cove, a distance of roughly 8.5 miles, and reported Dennis's disappearance to a ranger that night. As the days turned into weeks without any sign of Dennis, the search operation grew larger. The weather turned rainy, and a severe storm hit, a common occurrence in the national park after such incidents, making rescue attempts even more challenging, especially for the sniffer dogs. In the days that followed, the search became even more intense with the involvement of the police and FBI. And to everyone's surprise, the Green Berets flooded the Appalachian area, not searching for the young boy, but something different. Fully armed with sophisticated weapons of the time, their presence made it clear to civilians involved in the search that something more sinister was lurking behind the mountains. More people came forward to help in the search, and soon there were about 1,400 people and helicopters combing the area. However, the constant rainfall made it difficult, gradually washing away any trace of the young boy's trail. The rescue mission dragged on for weeks, and helpers started to lose hope. Just when it seemed like everyone might give up, an eyewitness named Harold Key reported something strange to the authorities. He said he heard a loud child screaming and saw a disheveled man with wild hair trying to hide before darting into the woods. A family from Carthage, Tennessee, on the Loop Road near Rowan Creek, also heard a child scream. The father ran over only to spot a man, unkempt and wild-looking, disappearing into the trees. To avoid triggering civil unrest, law enforcement agencies told Dennis's family they couldn't verify the credibility of the witnesses' testimonies. Unfortunately, Dennis was never found. Dennis's parents still believe he was taken that day, despite dismissals from the police and sheriff. The idea that Appalachia might be home to predators spread quickly, because if Dennis had gotten lost in the woods, it seems unlikely that over 1,000 people and hounds wouldn't have found him. Additionally, if he had been taken by a bear, the camp would have heard the commotion. The sounds of struggle would have been unmistakable. However, the theory that he was taken by someone in the woods made more sense, and the case remained strange and unsolved. Years passed, and while the Appalachian region recorded more cases, they were mostly isolated crime incidents. But then came the next case, a strange one that even triggered a presidential decree: disappearance of Trenny Gibson. 16-year-old Trenny Gibson disappeared without a trace during a school field trip. An FBI investigation uncovered a series of disturbing events leading up to her mysterious disappearance. In the days that followed, a search team of 200 people frantically scoured Clingman Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains, but only more questions were left unanswered. Did the teenage girl get lost? Was she attacked by an animal, or was it something more sinister? It all started with a surprise field trip announced at school. Trenny's favorite class was horticulture, taught by Mr. Dunlap. Known for his energetic and spontaneous teaching style, Mr. Dunlap excitedly told the students they were going on a field trip the next day without revealing the destination. Back in the 1970s, such rules weren't as strict, so nobody thought much of it. When Trenny got home and told her father about the trip, Mr. Gibson figured they were probably heading to the Smoky Mountains for a hiking adventure. As a former Eagle Scout and troop leader, he gave Trenny safety tips, like how to find north by looking at moss on trees and which plants could be eaten in an emergency. But the weather forecast called for dreary conditions the next day, and both Trenny and her father assumed the trip would be cancelled. As Trenny's mother drove her to school, they were surprised to see a bus parked out front, waiting to take the students on the mystery field trip. By 9 that morning, an announcement was made for Trenny and 37 of her horticulture classmates to load the bus bound for Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains. By midday, the group reached Clingman's Dome and parked the bus in the expansive parking lot. Mr. Dunlap quickly laid out the plan: a 2-mile hike to the top of Andrews Bald, where they would observe different plant and tree species at various elevations. They were tasked with writing a paper over the weekend discussing their findings. Due Monday, everyone was instructed to be back at the bus by 3:30 that afternoon. The 38 students quickly divided into smaller groups based on their walking pace as they set out along the Forney Ridge Trail. About an hour and a half into the journey, the group reached the summit of Andrews Bald and began making their way back to the bus. Trenny and her classmate Robert had been walking together the whole time until, unexpectedly, Robert told Trenny he was going to look for some bears and left her walking alone. The trail was narrow and slippery, with steep drop-offs on both sides. The group moved in a long, single-file line, and Trenny found herself in the middle, unable to veer off the trail without anyone noticing. As the group neared the bus, only 3/4 of a mile away, several of Trenny's friends said they saw her crouched down on the right side of the trail, perhaps examining something. When they looked back, she was gone. At first, no one gave it much thought, but little did they know, this was the last time anyone would see Trenny Gibson again. Only 37 students returned to the bus, but no one noticed Trenny Gibson was missing until Mr. Dunlap did a roll call. Frantically, Mr. Dunlap gathered a small group of the last remaining students back to the spot where Trenny was last seen. They retraced their steps along the trail, shouting her name at every bend, but there was no sign of her. By late in the afternoon, Mr. Dunlap had called the park rangers to report that Trenny was missing. The school bus left for Knoxville without Trenny or her teacher, who stayed behind to help in the search. By nightfall, word had spread over CB radio, and a small group of 19 park rangers and volunteers braved the cold wind, rain, and thick fog, using loudspeakers and whistles to call out for Trenny. But the only response was the sound of falling rain. Nothing else, just silence. The search would have to wait until morning, as temperatures dropped into the low 30s, with heavy wind and rain throughout the night. By early morning, Trenny's father arrived with a pair of her shoes to help the search dogs pick up her scent. The road across Newfoundland Gap was closed as a team of over 200 men, including 6 teams of bloodhounds and German shepherds, scoured every inch of the area. They worked in half-mile grids, extending out into a 25-mile radius. Every creek, cliff, trail, and bottom was carefully searched. But what happened next left everyone questioning what was going on in the area. The secret hunt in Appalachia. Surprisingly, just like in the Dennis Martin case, the military quickly got involved, responding almost immediately. From the air, 2 Army helicopters from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and several National Guard helicopters from North Carolina and Tennessee tried to scan the area. But the dense fall foliage, heavy fir trees, thick briar undergrowth, and heavy fog made an aerial search nearly impossible. Now the bloodhounds took over. Within hours, they picked up Trenny's scent and followed it from where she was last seen down the trail. It seemed she had taken a wrong turn and ended up on the Appalachian Trail. The scent led them to the concrete base of the Clingman's Dome Observation Tower. But then, the trail grew cold near Highway 441. The search for Trenny Gibson stretched on for 3 solid weeks in near-freezing temperatures, with the FBI getting involved. The 25-square-mile area was thoroughly combed, but there was no sign of her. No clothing, no shoes, nothing. She had simply disappeared without a trace. The FBI and park rangers later announced that they doubted she would ever be found in the mountains, hinting at the possibility of an abduction, something that brought back memories of a similar case a decade earlier involving Dennis. Every camping permit was tracked down, and the FBI investigated every person who had been in the area at the time, including individuals from as far away as Washington and Texas. Fearing a criminal abduction rather than some local myth like the feral people of Appalachia, Trenny's father even suggested that another student might be responsible for her disappearance. It turned out that Trenny had been involved in a troubling incident 2 years earlier. A student from Bearden High, Kelvin Bowman, had been stalking her. Obsessed with Trenny, he had even broken into the Gibson home, where Trenny's mother shot him in the foot. Kelvin was convicted and spent time in juvenile detention, making threats that he would take Trenny's life when he got out. The most astonishing part was that Knox County Schools placed Kelvin back in the same school as Trenny after his release. However, attendance records showed that Kelvin was in school all day on the day Trenny went missing. Investigators were left scratching their heads, right back at square one, unable to determine what happened to Trenny Gibson. If she had run into a stranger on the Appalachian Trail and met foul play, her remains would have been found. After all, 2 teenage girls' remains had been discovered buried in the same area during the 1970s. But if it was the work of the feral people, finding remains would be nearly impossible unless they wanted them to be discovered. For over 4 decades, countless searches have been carried out to find Trenny, including one surprisingly led by President Carter in 1981. Yet, like Dennis Lloyd Martin, no trace of Trenny Gibson has ever been found. She simply vanished. Surprisingly, these cases aren't the first of their kind in the Appalachia region. In fact, the first disappearance dates back to the 16th century, but this time, it wasn't just one person who vanished. It was an entire village with no trace left behind. The Pioneers. On July 25, 1587, 3 ships carrying English settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The group, led by Governor John White, included around 115 men, women, and children.
About 115 men, women, and children, along with John White, the governor, arrived off the coast of North Carolina,
all hoping to establish the first permanent English settlement in the New World. This wasn't the first attempt to settle Roanoke. 2 years earlier, a group of soldiers had tried but faced harsh conditions. They struggled with food shortages and constant attacks from hostile Native Americans. Many died, and those who survived barely managed to return to England. Determined to succeed, Governor White returned with a new group. Among them was his pregnant daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare. They dreamed of building a new life in America, and on August 18th, Eleanor gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America. However, their celebration was short-lived. The colony was running out of supplies, and they realized they wouldn't have enough to survive the coming winter. With no time to grow crops or raise livestock, someone needed to go back to England for more provisions. Just days after the birth of his granddaughter, White volunteered for the dangerous journey. The trip to England was long, taking 2.5 months. When White finally arrived in England, it was November. He quickly gathered supplies and prepared to return to Roanoke. But just as he was about to set sail, disaster struck. Queen Elizabeth I ordered a halt to all shipping due to the looming threat of the Spanish Armada. England was on the brink of war, and the Queen's focus shifted entirely to defense. White was forced to stay in England, hoping the people he left behind on Roanoke Island would survive the dangers of starvation and hostile natives. But little did he know, they were about to face an even more terrifying fate, one that would remain a mystery for centuries: the lost colony of Roanoke. While Governor White waited in England to return to the colony, the people of Roanoke were losing hope. They did not know the war brewing back home and had expected White to return within 6 months. But as time dragged on, turning into a year and then 2, their optimism began to fade. It wasn't until 3 years later that White could finally return to Roanoke Island. In the spring of 1590, with help from Sir Walter Raleigh, White was finally able to book passage on a convoy heading to America. They arrived at the Outer Banks in mid-August, where smoke was spotted rising from Roanoke Island. 2 boats were sent out, and the crew fired their cannons to announce their arrival. As they neared the island, they saw a large fire, but it was unclear whether it was natural or set by people. Once ashore, they moved toward the western edge of the island and found fresh footprints, but there was no sign of who they belonged to. Continuing their search, they came across a tree with the letters C-R-O carved into it. Near the entrance of the colony, they found another inscription, Croatoan, etched into a wooden post. The post was part of a makeshift defensive barrier around the abandoned colony. The area was overgrown with weeds and grass, suggesting it had been deserted for some time. The houses were gone, stripped of valuables, and all they found were a few cannons, some iron bars, and 5 looted chests. There was no sign of the roughly 115 colonists or their small boats. It seemed no one had lived there for a long time. The mysterious carvings hinted at answers, but nothing was certain. White wrote in his notes that before leaving in 1587, he had agreed with the colonists that if they were forced to leave before his return, they would leave behind a sign to show their new location. If they had left due to danger, they were to carve a cross to signal distress. Since no cross was found, White believed the colonists had safely moved to Croatoan Island. In a hurry, White returned to the ship and persuaded the captain to head to Croatoan. But as the crew prepared to sail, the anchor cable snapped. Without a spare anchor, the captain deemed the journey too risky. In the end, White never made it to Croatoan, and it was the last time he ever crossed the Atlantic. The The fate of the Roanoke colonists remained one of history's greatest mysteries until the early 1990s, when a remarkable discovery changed everything. Solving the centuries-old Appalachia region mystery. In 1937, while roaming the woods of North Carolina, a hunter named Lewis Hammond stumbled upon an unusual stone. Its surface bore strange carvings that seemed like they came straight out of Old English texts. When a history professor, Haywood J. Pierce, laid eyes on the stone, he was stunned. The engravings appeared to be a message from Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White, the governor of the vanished Roanoke colony. According to the markings, Eleanor, her husband Ananias, and their daughter Virginia had survived for some time after the colony's mysterious disappearance. The message recounted their struggles with disease, hunger, and violent confrontations with local tribes. The survivors dwindled to just 7. Eleanor had left a desperate plea for whoever found the stone to take it to her father, Governor White. On the other side, she chronicled their harrowing journey and the hardships they faced. Pierce believed he was onto something groundbreaking. Certain that this discovery might unlock the secrets of Roanoke, he purchased the stone and began a passionate search for more clues. Before long, another stone surfaced, this time in South Carolina, thanks to a man named Bill Eberhart. Astonishingly, this second stone complemented the first, adding fresh details to the tale. Eberhart's search didn't stop there. Over time, he unearthed dozens of similar stones scattered across the southeastern United States. Together, they wove a fascinating narrative. The story went that the colonists, after enduring unimaginable trials, had been taken in by Native Americans and eventually traveled as far as Georgia. Eleanor reportedly remarried within the native community and lived until 1599. However, the trail went cold after that, leaving the fate of her daughter Agnes and her new family shrouded in mystery. The discoveries caused a sensation. In 1940, Pierce called together a group of experts to investigate the so-called Dar Stones. At first, the academic world believed these stones were genuine relics from the past, but as more investigations unfolded, troubling inconsistencies began to emerge. To everyone's shock, it was revealed that the stones were an elaborate hoax. Yet, the first rock still stands out. Most agree it may be the only authentic one. Some researchers believe the people who left these stones might have migrated, driven by desperation that led them to cannibalism as hunger took hold. But this theory is still unproven, as the exact location of the colony's campsite has never been found. Yet, it couldn't be dismissed. And then, in the next British colony, built just 2 decades later, the settlers faced the same horrifying fate as the Roanoke colony. As starvation set in, they too were forced to make an unimaginable choice to survive. The horrors of Jamestown. In 2012, a shocking discovery was made in Jamestown, Virginia, the site of the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young girl, thought to be around 14 years old, in a buried trash pit within the settlement. The girl's remains, which included portions of her skull and shin bone, were found in a cellar beneath a building that had been part of the James Fort complex, dating back to 1608, revealing the desperate measures taken by settlers during the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period known as the Starving Time. These remains provided the physical evidence that historians had long speculated about but never confirmed. Cannibalism had indeed occurred at Jamestown, while historical records had mentioned the possibility of settlers resorting to such extremes. This was the first time physical evidence had surfaced to support those claims. Upon closer examination, it became clear that the girl's body had been butchered, with deep chop marks and cuts found on her skull and legs. These marks, made with cleavers and knives, indicated that her body had been processed for its meat after her passing. The face, including the cheeks, tongue, and brain, was particularly targeted, suggesting the settlers were desperate for any source of nourishment. The marks were not the work of a skilled butcher, revealing the frantic and inexperienced nature of the butchery. This wasn't just a simple case of food preservation, it was a survival strategy born of extreme hunger and necessity. The skull showed signs of being damaged by someone who didn't have the right tools or experience to handle such a task. After the skull was finally cracked open, the rest of the body was cut, especially around the throat and jaw, where the flesh was easier to reach. Scientists who studied the bones discovered that she had eaten a lot of protein in her lifetime, which suggests she came from a wealthier background. Her bones also showed that she didn't use dishes made with lead, which was common at the time. They figured out that she probably came from the southern part of England because of the type of water she drank as a child. Her diet was mostly European, and she hadn't been in Jamestown long before she passed away, meaning that she was one of the early settlers. The settlers of Jamestown, mainly soldiers and laborers, arrived in 1607 with great hopes but little knowledge of survival in the New World. Their gold hunting efforts were unsuccessful, and without a solid understanding of agriculture, they struggled to produce enough food. The region's salty waters and swampy land made securing fresh water difficult, and a drought exacerbated the situation. Within a year, only 38 of the original 104 settlers survived. Desperate for sustenance, they began stealing from the neighboring Powhatan tribe, which strained their only potential source of support. Despite expectations of aid, the 6 resupply shipments that arrived in 1608 and 1609 primarily brought more settlers, not supplies. By 1611, out of 400 settlers, only 61 remained, and no resupply ships had arrived. Investors, worried about the lack of profit, withdrew their support, making it even harder to bring in more supplies. Food became so hard to find that the settlers began eating anything they could get their hands on: horses, cats, rats, and even the leather from shoes. Tensions with the Powhatan tribe grew worse, and in their desperation, the settlers began to consider cannibalism. George Percy, the governor at the time, described the situation, saying, "Nothing was left to sustain life, and we resorted to the unimaginable, digging up the dead from their graves and eating them. Some even drank the blood of their fallen companions." He wasn't the only one to mention these gruesome acts. 5 other accounts also spoke of cannibalism during this time. In one chilling incident, a man got capital punishment for taking the life of his pregnant wife and feeding on her. Given how harsh the early days of Jamestown were, and how the colony had to resort to desperate measures before finally establishing itself, it's possible that the lost colony of Roanoke faced the same fate. Perhaps their descendants are still out there, roaming the Appalachian Mountains. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.